Welcome. Let's talk about the cross-sectional area, flow velocity, pressure and resistance within the arterial system. The principle of arborealization, which serves the purposes of gas exchange so well, also increases the cross-sectional surface area of the arterial system. The cross-sectional surface area of the arterial system is initially small at the level of the aorta, and it increases distally. The cross-sectional area then increases explosively to a maximum at the level of the capillary bed and post-capillary venules, and gradually decreases again as the larger venules converge on the vena cava. The entire cardiac output must flow through all regions of the circulation in 1 minute. It will flow slowly through areas of large cross-sectional area and quickly through areas of small cross-sectional area. This determines blood flow velocity. It is well known that resistance to blood flow increases dramatically with small decreases in radius. So it would seem logical to conclude that the narrowest vessels offer the greatest resistance to flow. But actually, this is just not the case. We have emphasized the incredible leakiness of the microcirculation. This is an absolute priority for the tissues. This leakiness, however, presents the possibility of rapid plasma loss or even loss of whole blood. In situations where there is bleeding or other causes of fluid loss from the vasculature, survival dictates that it is essential to be able to control and even completely cease blood flow to large areas of the microcirculation. Another issue is that the arterial pressures are high. A mean of 93 millimeters of mercury is normal. This cannot reach the tiny thin wall capillaries, or every one of them will rupture with massive bleeding into the tissues. So how can the cardiovascular system possibly control such massive leakiness and avoid the possibility of capillary rupture? Before we get to the capillaries, there are therefore some very small arterioles with abundant vascular smooth muscle in their tunica media, powerful enough to cause massive vasoconstriction. So, in the case of major trauma, they act like a spigot or a tap to turn off the blood flow to those tissues which are actively bleeding. The main site of resistance to flow in the systemic circulation is these small arterioles, and specifically the fourth order arterioles. These act as a choke point or a bottleneck to the flow of blood into the microcirculation. Proximal to the fourth order arterioles, the arterial system is a high pressure, phasic blood flow system. That is, phasic pressure alters from systole to diastole. Then the blood travels through the very muscular fourth order arterioles, which are much bigger than capillaries. But the abundant vascular smooth muscle can generate intense constriction, so as blood flows through these vessels, much of their potential energy is lost and their hydrostatic pressure drops. Kinetic energy also decreases and blood flow slows as it enters the microcirculation at a lower pressure. The abundant smooth muscle and the elasticity of the arterioles dampens the systolic-diastolic pressure oscillations completely, so distal to this point, arterial blood flow becomes a low-pressure continuous flow system, the capillaries requiring and receiving an inflow pressure of only 35 to 40 millimeters of mercury to drive blood through them, with a pressure at the venous end of the capillary of approximately only 10 millimeters of mercury pressure. Therefore, blood flow velocity in the aorta and the larger arteries is high. It decreases distally, reaching a minimum at the level of the capillary bed and gradually increases from the venules to the vena cava. The combination of large diameter and multiple branching vessels with rapid high-pressure blood flow predisposes this system to turbulent blood flow in the large arteries, especially at branch points, and this may be a factor in the predilection for atheroma deposition at such locations. Much slower, lower pressure, low kinetic energy blood flow, and very small vessel diameter decreases flow velocity and allows laminar flow to predominate at the capillary level. The lower hydrostatic pressure in the capillary allows the capillaries to be thin-walled to permit easy diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide and increase permeability for plasma flow into the interstitial fluid. The implication for the arterial system is that from the aortic valve to the start of the capillary, there are two very different arterial system compartments. In the proximal arterial compartment, the individual arteries are large, but total cross-sectional area is low, and flow velocities within them must be high. Flow is phasic between systole and diastole. In the distal arterial compartment, distal to the fourth order arterioles, the individual arterioles are narrow and flow velocities within them are low, causing laminar flow. This means that the blood flows through the vessels of the microcirculation much more slowly, with plenty of time for oxygen to dissociate from hemoglobin and for CO2 to travel partially as bicarbonate with some attached to hemoglobin. The capillaries can therefore have much thinner walls to facilitate exchange, and there are therapeutic opportunities for improving blood flow in these areas, such as the use of heparin to decrease viscosity and therefore increase microcirculatory blood flow. The terminal arteriole and its precapillary sphincters, the capillaries and the arteriovenous capillary thoroughfare channels constitute the microcirculation where exchange occurs. Now, just a quick word at this point about the venous system. I know we're talking about the arterial system, but for completion, let's talk about the venous system briefly. The venules are relatively large diameter vessels with thin walls. The cross-sectional area of the venules is very large and blood flow velocity through them is very slow. A distal pressure of 10 millimeters of mercury at the start of the venous system, which are the tiny venules, is adequate to drive the blood, that is to the venous return, through the very low resistance of the venules, which gradually become confluent with larger and larger veins, ultimately to reach either the SVC or the IVC. We will talk more about the marvels of the venous system a little later. In an earlier video, we discussed the metabolic demands made by the 37 trillion cells in an average 72 kilogram human. Now, we must consider how our cardiovascular system chooses to meet those needs. Just consider the following observations for a moment. Stay with me. The blue whale has a heart the size of a car, and it beats only 8 to 10 times per minute. While, at the other end of the spectrum, the hummingbird has the tiniest heart imaginable, 0.05 grams, and beats between 200 and even up to 1200 beats per minute. What is the human cardiovascular system's strategy for pumping blood, and why does it choose this particular strategy? With a hemoglobin of 15 grams per deciliter and an arterial oxygen saturation of 100%, each litre of blood will have an oxygen content of 200 mils. However, the venous blood leaving the tissues still contains up to 150 mils of oxygen, so oxygen delivery to the tissues from 1 litre of arterial blood is 50 ml. The resting oxygen consumption of the total body per minute is 250 ml, so this will require 5 litres of fully oxygenated blood to be delivered to the tissues per minute. Because oxygen delivery is a non-negotiable physiological mandate, the cardiac output at rest must not be less than 5 litres per minute to meet the oxygen delivery demands of the tissues. That is, 250 mils of oxygen per minute. Pumping a larger cardiac output than this at rest would be superfluous blood flow and will totally destroy the physiological economy of the body, because every unnecessary heartbeat represents a lot of wasted energy. So the normal resting cardiac output represents the minimal acceptable oxygen delivery. Now, of course, with exercise, oxygen demands increase, and so does cardiac output. But before we consider the demands of exercise physiology, let us stay with resting values, which happen to be closer to those existing in the patient under general anesthesia or during heavy sedation in the ICU. So, the left ventricle must pump 5 litres per minute at rest, but the systemic vascular resistance located in the fourth order arterioles limits the forward blood flow velocity of arterial blood. To drive a large volume of blood, say 200 mils, through this resistance during a single systole would require very high arterial pressures for a very long sustained time. This would require an intense, sustained systolic contraction by the left ventricle. When the heart has to generate high sustained systolic pressures, the oxygen and energy consumption increases dramatically. The increase is very disproportionate. And we see this in untreated essential hypertension, and the chronic consequences of this are ultimately left ventricular hypertrophy, because a normal sized ventricle certainly would be totally inadequate to the task. The heart is much more efficient at generating lower arterial pressures and doing this more frequently. Another way to look at this is frequent low pressure contractions are more efficient in terms of oxygen and energy consumption than slower, sustained high pressure contractions. Optimal energetics for this system dictate that our left ventricle pumps a modest volume of blood, only 70 mL, and it does it frequently, that is at 72 beats per minute. And this heart rate of 72 beats per minute gives a cardiac cycle duration of 800 milliseconds. And this is divided as 300 milliseconds of systole and 500 milliseconds duration of diastole. This duration of systole is brief enough to be consistent with very reasonable metabolic oxygen demands for the left ventricle. Note that 70 mL of volume ejected 72 times per minute produces a cardiac output of slightly over 5 litres. In order to drive 70 mL through the systemic vascular resistance in 300 milliseconds, however, still requires a mean arterial pressure of 93 millimeters of mercury in the arterial system, so the left ventricle fills to approximately 100 mL in diastole, and this is called the left ventricular end diastolic volume, and then its muscle fibers contract enough to expel a stroke volume of 70 mL, or 70% of its contents, in approximately 300 milliseconds of systole. This leaves 30 mL of blood in the ventricle at the end of systole, and we call this the end systolic volume. When systole is over, the mitral valve opens and blood from the atria and the great veins enters the left ventricular cavity. This volume of 70 mL is called diastolic filling volume, and in steady state conditions nearly always equals the stroke volume. The fraction of blood ejected as a percentage of the total volume of the ventricle, 70/100, gives a concept called the ejection fraction as a percentage, which is normally of the order of 70% in healthy people at rest. A normal 72 kilogram person at rest has a blood volume of 5 litres and a cardiac output of 5 litres with a heart rate of 72 beats per minute, so now it is easy to remember that one 5 litre blood volume circulates once in 1 minute, because the cardiac output is also 5 litres per minute. So as an aide-memoire, you can remember that the normal blood volume and the normal cardiac output is 70 mL per kilo and 70 mL per kilo per minute, respectively. So I like to conceptualize blood flow through the circulation as little packets or little quanta of 70 mL stroke volumes traveling around the circulation, 72 of them per minute at rest. Now, the left ventricular cavity is approximately the same size and shape as a large lemon. It is an ellipse or ellipsoid, but to simplify things, I like to refer to the heart as a spherical bag of muscle, and like any muscle, it needs to rest after contraction. This is particularly true of the left ventricle because the left ventricle receives zero blood supply during systole, and it relies entirely on diastole for its blood flow and its perfusion. When resting, a heart rate of 72 beats per minute gives a cardiac cycle duration of 800 milliseconds, as we said, 300 of systole and 500 milliseconds of diastole. And like any muscle, there is a degree of muscle shortening which allows it to function at its most efficient. And for myocardial muscle fibers, it's about 21%. It shortens by 21% of its original resting length. Now, this may seem a little arcane, but interestingly, it's of major importance to modern cardiologists evaluating left ventricular function, and so it must be important to ICU doctors and cardiac anesthesiologists alike. Recall that the formula for the volume of a sphere tells us that the volume changes with the cube of the radius, and by extrapolation as the cube function of the circumference. If this spherical bag of muscle holds approximately 100 mils of blood, then a degree of muscle fiber shortening of 21% is the most energetically favorable degree of shortening to generate a decrease in volume of the sphere from diastole to systole equal to approximately 70 mLs, that is, the maximum ejection of blood per unit of myocardial oxygen demand. So this is why the typical stroke volume is 70 ml. Now let's consider the situation when the individual is not at rest and the cardiac output must increase. What options does the cardiovascular system have? Well, consider this formula below. This is the second law of the cardiovascular system. It tells us that if the heart rate is constant and the stroke volume increases by 50%, then the cardiac output will increase by 50%, and vice versa. It also tells us that if the stroke volume is constant and the heart rate increases by 50%, cardiac output will also increase by 50%, etc. So a healthy heart can change cardiac output with an increase in heart rate or an increase in stroke volume. In effect, it has 2 degrees of freedom. It can modulate the heart rate or it can modulate the stroke volume. But most often, it exhibits very subtle control over cardiac output with moderate changes in stroke volume and moderate changes in heart rate simultaneously.